And thanks a lot for a wonderful sort of introduction. And you've raised a lot of very pertinent points. I was also thinking along the same lines. When Mimi got that, when she was campaigning for the Hugo Award, one of the things that did come up was the aspect of caste, right? And for those of you who are not initiated into this, so Mimi Mondol is one of the emerging Dalit science fiction writers. She's from Jadavpur University, but one of the things which should not have come up was caste, but as they say in India, usually everything can, even before communalism, probably caste is something that sort of crops up. And yes, absolutely agree with that. With the idea that science fiction is also literature of protest, and even traditional mainstream science fiction, would involve aspects of protest. If you look at a lot of Asimov, would be sort of critiquing aspects of society. So just to sort of put in a couple of words into what obviously was not a domain for me, but and to come back to what is going to be a workshop, and I'm not going to present any slides because this is a workshop and I do expect people to respond. So the very first thing is, please switch on your videos. It's absolutely impossible to judge what you're doing if I don't have any video response. So please do that. The second thing is, if you're patently not interested in doing this workshop and you're here simply to fill up numbers, please leave. It's you have to write out responses. There are long questions as well. So don't hang around for the heck of it. You'll get your certificates. Don't worry. So on those two notes, I would like to begin with obviously the big elephant in the room, which is what is science. And what is science is an important point for beginning, because we are not very sure, and I'm pretty sure that most of us are not very sure what do we mean by science. For example, how many of us would say that homeopathy is a science? You can raise your hands. I can see your responses up here. How many of you would think that homeopathy is a science? Nobody. But I know they're like, oh, this sounds like a suspicious question. But I'm sure somebody here takes homeopathy and would think that it's science. Would anyone be there? Raise your hands, please. You can do it digitally. Yes, Umesh is there. Thank you for breaking what was seeming like a very difficult ice to break. So Umesh thinks it's a science. Anyone else? How many of you take homeopathic medicines for anything? And it's a popular thing, right? Great, wonderful. Some more people, Arundhati, I can see some more people that are raising their hands. Thanks a lot. So, why do you think homeopathy is a science? Why would you think that homeopathy is a science? And just to preempt an answer, okay, Shubhadeep has his hand up. Would you like to just have a go at it? Why do you think homeopathy? Okay, Umesh has his hand and it's waving as well. So, Umesh, could you just say, why do you think homeopathy is a science? Umesh, am I audible? Or Shubhadeep, anyone, or Ragini? Why do you think homeopathy is a science?
Well, I'm not an expert on that, but sir, I think because they deal with these chemical compositions which they give us, so it is obviously related to science only.
All right, wonderful. So, and this is usually the answer which is given, that, I mean, there are two answers. The other answer, which is the more interesting answer, is that it is taught in the academia, right? So, for example, there are entire colleges of homeopathy which sort of exist, and you have to sit for an entrance test, and, it must be an organized body of knowledge. And they say it is science, so therefore it must be science. Wonderful. Can someone tell me what is the medicine that homeopathy prescribes for sleeplessness? And if while you think over it, I'll tell you how homeopathy works. And if you don't believe me, you can read up on the theory. And of course, I'm sort of bringing it all together, I'm condensing it. But the theory is something like this: like, sort of cures like. So, homeo means like, like, and pathy is like some sort of treatment. So, let's say that something causes X symptom, then that in extreme dilution, and the extreme dilutions are like dilutions in like a universal level of universe of molecules would not probably have a single molecule of that. So that's an extreme level of dilution, and they sort of achieve it through multiple dilutions, which you can read up on. But in extreme dilution, that same thing will cure it. All right. So let me give you an example. Let's say your face is all puffed up. Your eyes have gone red, your cheeks have gone red, and tears are falling out of your eyes and nose and everything, right? And you go to a homeopath, and he'll look at you and he'll say, aha, I know what the solution to this problem is. And, so what is it? And it's onions. What causes these symptoms? When you peel onions, tears come out of your eyes and of your nostrils, your face goes red. And if you don't believe me, you can check this out. The treatment for the common cold or allergies and even for asthma is allium cepa, which is the Latin name for onions, right? So diluted onion juice. And they're so diluted that you'll be lucky to have a single molecule of it, right? Now, I'm not saying, I'm not trying to pass judgment on it, but to give you the answer to my previous question, what would you be given if you have sleeplessness at night? It is coffee, right? So the what you'll be prescribed will be Cafe Arabica or whatever the Latin name of coffee beans is. And we have to keep this thing in mind that science is not simply a product of an institution or an institutional sanction. And moreover, it is not a product of simply, a claim to an organized body of knowledge. It's not simply that. There is something more to it. And there's a particular history of science and there's a particular methodology of science that we have to interrogate. And I would draw your attention to a very, very important work, which is by this philosopher called Thomas Kuhn. And I'm sure that many of you would have read Kuhn in your research methodology when you guys are, sort of reading about paradigm shifts, right? So you can look at Kuhn's work and he really outlines a lot of very interesting ideas about what makes science science. But I will try to keep this very simple. So instead of going into jargonistic philosophy, we'll go back to our class 5 textbooks where science has been thankfully defined for all of us. And I'm sure that all of us have passed class 5. And you'll find in a very, very simplistic sort of a sense, science is a method. All right. And this is something which has to be distinguished from science being, let's say, a political tool. And that's also how we would think of science, right? Let's say the entire business of the ecosphere and how the third world is right now being pushed into a corner that you cannot burn fossil fuel. You must invest in extremely dangerous nuclear technologies or extremely expensive renewables, which we obviously, are not going to be able to get right away. So we are dependent on the West. And the West itself is polluting, almost 400 times or 500 times what anyone of us are doing, right? So there are, politics and there are power equations. That's how many people look at science. Many people would think of science as something which is simply a belief system. It's just a way to attack religion. And this is something which I often get. Students will come and say, oh, science, sir, is something just to, attack religion. And it's not really there for any useful purpose. It's just used to attack my identity and who I am. Many other people think of it as, and this is also a very popular assertion which is happening now, that, it becomes a way for the West to suppress existing native knowledge systems, right? So you'll find this assertion coming up, and even our, even our state, our ministry would often come out and say, see, we have our own native medicines. We have our own native technologies, right? We have our own native history of engagement with science, which would include the Udan Khatola in the Ramayana and would go all the way down to, all sorts of cures of corona, which come in kits, which of course are all very dangerous. But I'm not going to comment on those particularly, but I think that the indication should suffice. So science is also seen as a way of culturally dominating existing nativist knowledge systems. And this is not only in India, this is across the world. I have a friend in Ghana was saying that the same problem exists in their society, and the sort of cultural nationalist assertion is also going on. But in contrast to all of this and going back right to the basics, what I'm proposing is that science is instead a method for deciding what is knowledge and what is not. It's a way of creating knowledge, and it's based on, and we know this, I'm sure that we all know this, that it is based on observation. You make an observation regarding certain thing. You create a hypothesis that is a working solution. You create some sort of a hypothesis. You work out that hypothesis through repeated experimentation. So you sort of create some, experiments. You take a test subject, you create an experiment subject, and then you sort of compare the results and you try to, eliminate all other possibilities. And eventually the idea is that you develop some sort of a theory. You develop some sort of a model. And this theorization in science is a predictive modeling. That means that it will hold true in the future, and therefore it is knowledge. So it is not merely enough to say that, oh, X drug, sort of is going to, make your cough go away. That's really not the point. But rather that X drug is proven that given, any sort of, given any sort of situation, it will always work better then a placebo pill, which is a fake pill. So it's not just your psychology which is making you better. The modern drug must be better than everything through a rigorous process of testing, which may take long periods of time and involves nowadays it's sort of shortened by using AI and big data analysis and many other things. And that's how we got the COVID vaccines out so very quickly. But it's a very, very interesting, engaging, and of course, it's a wonderful process which can be great for humanity, right? So science has a particular methodology. It's a method. It's not simply some sort of a mumbo jumbo. And we all, I think, because we have all done science, and that's one of the great things about the Indian education system, is that we have all done science at some point in our lives, and we sort of understand that it's somewhat different. So on a positive note, instead of simply criticizing science, beginning on a positive note, let's just sort of keep that in one place and move on to the second part. And this should be easier because we are all students of literature. What do we mean by fiction? Fiction, of course, is something which is creative, something which has been made up and would root itself in the imaginaries of prosaic fiction, which develop, and for us in English, we'll have to go back to what the development is in England. And you would sort of remember that earlier, let's say, and if you look at just the novel form, to give you an idea of the sort of development which happens, you'll find that right in the beginning, the sort of texts that come out in the novel form, they would be these sentimental sort of plays, and they would be different from chronicles because they're not based on some existing history or some existing travel, right? So you'll sort of differentiate between, let's say, the travels of Marco Polo, or Ralph Fitch, which would be seen as chronicles, and or for that matter even Gulliver's Travels, although it's completely fictional, right? And let's say even Robinson Crusoe, right? And you differentiate that from, let's say, Pamela, which would be seen as a novel, a sentimental novel based on a plot, a development of characters, a lot of other characters coming in. There's an involvement and a plot development, and and all of that, right? And I'm sure that we've all read E.M. Foster's aspects of a novel, so we understand that there's a difference happening over there. And then from there we see how the romantic imaginary kicks in, and you get the historical novels. And from the historical novels, you have a very important development, which is a precursor to science fiction. You have the development of Gothic fiction, right? And what I'm placing, or what I would like to place in front of you, and I'm sure that there has been work done in the area, that Gothic fiction is essentially science fiction with mumbo jumbo, right? And to rephrase, science fiction is essentially Gothic fiction without the mumbo jumbo. What you've done is you've removed the religion, you've removed the superstition, you've removed the monsters and all the strange things which are sort of going on. And instead, what you have is a new sort of a scientific explanation for what is happening. And you would probably, sort of remember now Northanger Abbey, which is a very important text. It's written by Jane Austen, which is a Gothic fiction, but it sort of tries to explain the reasons behind. There's a reasoning behind the monsters and all, right? So they try to give some rational explanation as to why things happen. So that's the important part of what Jane Austen is doing. It's very different from all the other Gothic texts, which are usually just blood and gore and ghosts and women are being chased all over the place, and all sorts of things of that sort, sensational sort of a thing, which is the oeuvre of Gothic fiction. Now, so moving on from that, and the very first text, and this is something that all of us know, which sort of transcends or just moves the border over from Gothic fiction into science fiction, would probably be Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, right? And we all know the story of Frankenstein. It's about this, and Frankenstein, of course, is not the name of the creature; it's the name of the scientist. And the scientists went to this university in Germany. So he's a student of this university in Germany, and he sort of learns about science, and he's a really good student. And on learning about science and what science can do, he figures out that if you run electricity through a dead body, you can bring it back to life. So he gets many carcasses, and he sort of sews the different parts of the bodies together in order to make one huge sort of a creature, and brings it to life. Don't try this at home. It's probably a very dangerous experiment, and I can assure you that no one is going to come to life, right? But nonetheless, so he creates this sort of a monster through passing electricity through that creature, and it comes to life. And then there's a very and many other things that are happening in that text. And we know the rest of the story. He goes to the Arctic, and eventually the creature is sort of killed off over there, right? So the very first text which sort of brings in science, in a very direct sort of a way, and I can so say that the very first science fiction text, at least in England, coming out of England, would be Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and we would know this. But the person who really makes science fiction very popular, or and in fact, he's so popular that movies are being made on his works even now. Even now, digital games are being made on his work even now. And this is another name that all of us would know, that is H.G. Wells, right? And Wells is this absolutely brilliant exponent of science fiction writing, and his influence, can be stretches into as well. I mean, if you look at Satyajit Ray's Professor Shonku, and that was mentioned in the previous session, that's essentially sorry, I'm sorry, I'm not talking about Professor Shonku right now. I mean, if you look at, let's say, the movie, so if you look at, let's say, The War of the Worlds, right? It's been turned into a movie even 5 years back, all right? And it was converted, and there's a very interesting story about that particular text. It was converted into a radio play by no one less than Orson Welles. And Orson Welles, you would remember as this iconic American film actor and also director, who's famous for the movie Citizen Kane. It's one of the great American movies. And so when Orson Welles was much younger and he was working in the radio, they converted that text into a news format reading. So it was like, other programs were going on, and suddenly there would be this 30-second sort of interlude where they would be presenting the War of the Worlds. And it started out like a news bulletin that, I would like to break in. There's some strange objects have been seen on top of Miller's farm somewhere in the Midwest, and we'll let you know what the proceedings are. Then after half an hour, there's some song and dance, something is going on. Then someone comes in and says, oh, those are actually things from outer space, and the police have been called in, and we'll let you know whatever the update is. So this goes on throughout the day, and they create a mass panic by which, millions of Americans actually drive out of their homes with towels on their head to save themselves from the, noxious gas that the aliens are deploying, only to find that nothing has happened. And where they're promptly arrested for causing a national panic, right? So, so science fiction is very, very interesting, engaging, and is something that people take to very quickly because it has that authority of science, which actually it does not. And we'll have to deconstruct that later. But whenever you say science fiction, people have this expectation that this is closer to the truth, that it's going where it's, more serious literature among the more non-serious popular fiction literatures. Of course, I don't think literature departments look at it this way. I mean, literature department people, we already know that sci-fi is just pop fake. It's not really very serious. But among the common masses, if you look at the common masses, you'll probably think you'll see some attitude of reverence towards science fiction, right? And which is why all these millions of Americans came out thinking that the aliens have invaded, right? And because it's coming out of the radio and it sounds like a news piece and all. So science fiction, by simply adding science in front of the fiction, you're turning this entire thing into a valid and a more agreeable sort of a domain for discussing other things. And this is a very important political function, which is sort of taken up by H.G. Wells as well, right? And you can see that in his Time Machine. And I'm sure that all of us would have read Time Machine. I'm going to very quickly just get over this Western section so that we can go to the Indian science fiction. But if we all would have read Time Machine, and it begins on this note where all these 7-8 men, right? And they're described as the journalist, the editor, the author, the writer, and the medical man, the lawyer. They all get together in the house of this individual scientist, right? And this individual scientist seems to have no other work. I mean, he does not, unlike us, we have to teach, we have to correct papers, we have to do 50 other things, but this guy has no other. He simply has this big house, and that big house has a big tunnel, and at the end of that tunnel, there's this underground laboratory, and he seems to have all the money in the world. Servants come out of nowhere and present food and liquor and, smokes for everybody. There are no women to be seen at all, and that's something that we have to also keep in mind, that often in science fiction, women will be sort of marginalized or completely absent or other things, and we'll get to that in the course of the workshop. But coming back, so all of these people get together, and this person gives us the narrative of traveling forward into time, right? Usually seen as one of the first, sort of engagements of what will happen in the future. But if you look at the underlying story, it's about how humanity divides into two groups or two species, for the want of a better word, the Morlocks and the Eloi. The Morlocks are the descendants of the working class people who, because they've been working through and through, through and through, through and through, they have now become brawnier and scrawnier and hairier and more scarier, right? In general, and they live underground, and they are going to come out, and they're feeding on the Eloi, who are like frail, delicate, almost like elf-like creatures, and they're sort of rearing the Eloi like chicken, like just like we rear chicken. So it's like a warning that if you don't reduce this gap between the rich and the poor, between the exploited and the exploiter, if there is no regulatory laws coming out, then this is the future that humanity faces. So actually, it's not about the future at all. It's about Victorian society, labor in industrial society, in late Victorian society, England, and what to do about it. So it's of socialism. It's not really a text of futurism per se, right? And in fact, the logic which it uses is Lamarckism, and Lamarckism, as you would know, is that whatever happens in your through your life, changes in the phenotype. So let's say your hand is cut off, transferred to your genotype, which we know is not true, right? I mean, if somebody, God forbid, loses his hand, decides to have a kid, their kid will also have a hand. It's not that they won't. Giraffes' necks did not grow taller because horses stretched out for the leaves. They grew taller because there were random mutations, which eventually, through natural selection, allowed for creatures with longer necks to survive in that niche better. So Lamarck was wrong and Darwin was right. So, and this is something that H.G. Wells already knows. So Wells knows that this is not happen, but he's using that trope. So it's not really science at all. It's not science at all. Another thing I would like to draw your attention to is that if you look at the description of the time machine, you'll find that it has, nickel and, chrome and, all these things which sort of signify the best materials of his age. I mean, today we would probably write carbon fiber or, stuff which we would think of as the latest materials. But among all those things, there is interesting component, and that component is ivory. All right. So between the crystals, between the nickel, between the chrome, there must be some Indian ivory. You can't really have the time machine. So immediately the colony sort of comes in. The exotic colony must come in and provide that mysterious mystique element that is going to allow for time travel, right? It's something which is sort of relegated in the East, and you can do a sort of an Orientalist reading of many of the science fiction of that period, because it sort of uses the East in that way as an exotic. So, so with these sorts of preliminary comments, I would like to enter into the next sort of section, because we have to move on to Indian science fiction in that sense. And if we begin with the text that I have already sent out, and I'm sure that you've read the text. If any of you have not read the text, I would recommend that you read them, because if you don't read the text, you won't really understand what I'm talking about. But see, this is written by a very, very, all these texts are written by one author. I did not take up multiple authors so that we could discuss one particular thematic in some detail, which I think is more fair given the limitations of a 1.5 hour workshop, which is what this is supposed to be. But we shall also note that this is a text in translation, because the original text would probably read differently and would probably be received differently, simply because it's in a different language. And this has been translated, of course, by Amrit Jyoti Mahanta, who's a wonderful, Ahamya writer and critic in his own right. So he's one of the great writers in his own right. But Dinesh Chandra Goswami is a very, very interesting person. He's won awards, and 2 of his national awards are for children's literature, and he's also won, of course, multiple awards for Ohomia literature. And this is something that keeps on happening when you talk about popular fiction, particularly even science fiction, right? You usually think of it as children's fiction, right? You think of it as something that young kids read, right? And therefore, the sort of texts which are produced, or which would be thought of as science fiction, would usually be texts that would be sort of removed from sex and sexuality, right? So if you think of, let's say, Arthur Conan Doyle's stories, like, just like Sherlock Holmes, he also has this other character called Professor Challenger, right? And Professor Challenger is the direct precursor to Professor Shonku, which is a character created by Satyajit Ray. So Ray is really, really inspired by Conan Doyle, right? He takes the Feluda stories from Sherlock Holmes, and he takes the Professor Shonku stories from Professor Challenger. And I'm sure there are fans of Satyajit Ray who are like, no, Ray was the better one. And I'm not denying Ray's greatness. All that I'm saying is that there's a direct link. between the two authors. Now, Professor Challenger as well as Professor Shunku are completely asexual pieces, right? Just like Sherlock Holmes. If you haven't read Professor Challenger, I'm sure you've read Sherlock Holmes. So they're completely asexual spaces. And that would be how it would be presented for young adults in those days, right? As something which is fine for them. So sexuality would not be the domain of children and young adults. Unlike today, I mean, my mother is a teacher in nursery and in the army schools, and they talk about the importance kids about proper sexuality, right? So they talk about good touch and bad touch right in the pre-KGs nowadays, and you cannot simply keep kids away from sexuality. You have to prepare them for this world. There's no other way out, because children are usually subject to all sorts of violence, and that has been their experience. So now all the army schools, all the army pre-nurseries and nurseries, they will talk to the kids about good touch. We are talking about the late 1800s, in England, Victorian decency, Victorian morality, any sort of sex or sexuality in the text at all, and it would actually be much later, and almost the 1950s or so, when you will start getting some sort of, you'll get some hints of, okay, sexuality or some explorations into gender in science fiction, so for a long domain, almost for, let's say, 60 years or so, maybe a little more than that, and even later after that, science fiction would be seen as the domain of young readers, children, young adult readers, and therefore necessarily a space which is not to be sexualized, something which is not really to be sort of seen in that sort of light, right? I would mention, I mean, there are many texts, I mean, which have sexuality in science fiction, but I would like to mention one because it's one of the central texts, which does it, and it's written by, of course, a woman. It's Ursula K. Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness in 1969, right? Contrary to how women are often placed in science fiction narratives, where they're just outlying characters somewhere, or they're just ancillary support somewhere. In the writing of science fiction, as I have already noted, you will find right at the beginning there is a woman, Mary Shelley, and also in this sexual turn which comes about in the early in the late 1960s and 70s, you'll find women like again Marge Piercy's Woman on the Edge of Time, that's in 1976. Joanna Russ, The Female Man, 1970, and of course going back to the main text, The Left Hand of Darkness, which talks about these androgynous beings on a different planet, right? So this sort of brings in sex, into science fiction and explorations into sex, sexuality, and gender in a very, very serious sort of a way, right? And of course, nowadays, if you really think of it, you'll find sex in science fiction ranging from social criticism, rethinking gender roles, and even in things like pornography, right? So you'll find it all over the place. And there are people who have spoken about it. So you can just to sort of look at somebody, Rob Latham has this very interesting text called Sextrapolation in New Wave Science Fiction. It came out in 2006. So you can look at Rob Latham and others. So this is now a really, sort of a broad field. So nowadays, if someone says science fiction, post, let's say, things, I mean, starting from even TV and let's say the mini series which are happening today on streaming. So today, thinking of sex in science fiction is like a very common thing. We don't really question it. But for almost 60 years of its existence and well into the 90s also, you would think of science fiction largely as children's literature, right? And the prize, of course, which is given to Goswami is for children's literature, right? It's not for other things. So so having sort of just given some sort of a broad overview of what is science fiction and what is science and what is fiction, and how it sort of evolved from a Gothic root, and how it sort of is not really about science, just like homeopathy, which is not really about science at all. It's mumbo jumbo. The mumbo jumbo of Gothic is replaced by scientific mumbo jumbo, which nonetheless is not science. And what science fiction does is it simply reproduces the concerns and the dominant cultural values and ideologies of the author and of the author's age, right? So just like H.G. Wells' Time Machine, it's not really a mirror into the future. It's not. What it is a mirror into his society, into the concerns of 18th century Victorian England. You know, what are they going through? What are the tensions of their society? And therefore, we must read science fiction also as products of that particular time and age. So, on this note, we are going to take a brief pause for some questions, but also I'm going to use this space to give out this link to a couple of short questions. Please don't think of this as a test. This is just a way for us to make sure that you're there, you're participating, you're given out the link on the chat box. Please keep in mind only the people who fill up these forms will be given. I mean, so it's really encouraged that you go through this quickly and you please fill it up. And the next is now open to questions as well. So if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand and I'll take them one by one. Right. It's as you open the form, and we have time, so don't worry if you have any questions. Yes, Aina Singh, please go ahead. And while Aina is sort of setting up her earphones, the
Sir,
others also, if you have questions, you may go ahead. Yes, please, Aina.
the questioning of science as an authority in the so-called global south or two-thirds world, whatever we want to call it, in the science fiction that we are now producing and writing about, does the questioning and destabilization of authority of science within those texts sort of take us back to a more gothic idea of fiction again? Are there strong parallels between these two?
All right, that's an interesting question. I really have not thought of it as an atavistic turn, but see, there are multiple influences at work. So there is a cultural nationalist turn, which I was talking about, right, which is also a critique of Western science. All right. So when you look at that cultural nationalist turn, you'll see that the sort of race, the reassertion of race, all right, something which we had stopped doing in the 1920s. But even today, many people would come and talk about, let's say, caste as race, all right, which is patently non-Ambedkarite. So if you read Baba Saheb Ambedkar, actually I should say Bhimrao Ambedkar, because he himself does not like to be turned into a Mahatma. He's written this wonderful letter on why you must not call me anything other than my name, which is Bhimrao Ambedkar. He talks about how caste is not a product of race. And he talks about the origin of the Dalits as being rooted in having a different religious ethical system. He says that it's the remnant Buddhists who are Dalits, and he says this way before he converts. He does not say this when he converts. He says this way before he converts. He also talks about the origin of the other background. Really scholarly works. He's really gone through his reference. I mean, he's read the entire of Indian Sanskritic tradition and has wonderful references. So if you really want to read, you must read Ambedkar. There is no running away from Ambedkar, in these sorts of matters. Is that it's very important to understand that it's not just a criticism of science and going back to a gothic horror, right? For example, look at Stranger Things. I'm giving you a text from today, which all of you would have probably seen on Netflix, right? So this is cosmic horror, right? And it's coming from H.P. Lovecraft. You're encountering this complete other, like the Call of Cthulhu, and if you look at Lovecraft's sort of cosmology of others, they're actually a precursor alien race who have come to Earth before, and suddenly this portal opens out and you can sort of visit, right? You'll find the same sort of a gameplay in Half-Life. If you guys have not played the game, sort of an idea, right? It's all coming from Lovecraft and Lovecraftian monsters. But that this is a very different sort of an engagement with science or a rejection of science than which you will find on, let's say, if you look at this game called Asura, right, which came out recently. I think it's made by Flying Bot Studios. You can check that out. Let me see if I can find it. I'll share it over here. So, sorry, Ogrehead Studios. This by Ogrehead Studios. So over there, the narrative is racial. Okay, it's racial. It's not the same sort of thing. So there are many sort of contenders against science. It's not simply the Gothic supernatural. That's one of them. But there are other imaginaries at work. So we need to be very clear, who is it that has a problem with science? So many people have a problem with science, but who is it? So that ideological depth has to be sort of searched in order to really get to a better understanding of that question. So on that note, I don't think I answer your question, but that's my preliminary sort of a remark on that.
Thank you.
Right. Right. Thank you, Anna. Ragini?
Yes, sir. Thank you for such an engaging lecture. My question to you is that in these science fiction novels that you mentioned, terror is a constant theme which keeps on appearing over and over again. And even if we read the science fictions today, like I remember the novel which, when the pandemic started, Dean Kunz's The Eyes of Darkness. That was actually trending and people were reading. I also read it. And one thing which I have seen constantly appears is that science is involved there, but they kind of dramatize it and they cash in on the terror. They terrorize you to, hook you up. Like, we cannot stop reading because terror is always involved in that. Like this whole thing about that this virus thing and that Wuhan thing, which was mentioned in the novel, this whole thing about the biological weapons. So, but at the end, it was like kind of became a sensational fiction and the science fiction thing. So why do they kind of merge in? Like, whenever we read science fiction novels, there's this sort of a dramatic turn which the writer gives and makes it a kind of thriller, and some things which even I don't think that the scientists would agree with. They use certain terminologies which do not really exist. So this whole kind of a thing, like genre becomes a fantasy sort of, like the use of telekinesis, or if I say telepathy, which is there in the book. So what is your take on that?
Right. That's a wonderful observation, and you're right, and that's precisely what I'm saying. That science fiction is not about science at all, and there's nothing about science in it. It's ideological, So other things are happening, other things are going on. They are being validated by sort of invoking the name of science, and it's interesting thing that you sort of pick out that link between terror, and which is, I said, that it's basically Gothic revisited, right? It's Gothic revisited with some sort of a scientific mumbo jumbo. That's what's going on. Think of the Matrix. The Matrix are dark tunnels, very little light. These again Lovecraftian squids, like the tentacled monsters, mechanical tentacled monsters, running behind you, and you're sort of going through these labyrinths. It's the same story as the Cretan bull, right? Where you have this hero with a sword and that woolen thing, and he's going through that labyrinth, and the Minotaur is chasing him, and so that is what is going on, and that's how it's going to be graphically presented in a movie as well, right? So this is not really about science. Let's try and understand that it's a criticism of our own day and age. There's an ideological contention which is going on, and probably science gives it a validity. That's the first thing. And the second thing is it allows a sort of a discourse to unfold under the eyes otherwise would censor it. So if you talk about it too openly, let's say H.G. Wells said it out openly that, do something about the working class, right? Probably the Queen would be like, here, you are doing something wrong. I'm going to haul you up and put you up in, behind bars. So to prevent that sort of thing from happening, probably you're invoking futurism. So let's understand that this is what science fiction is doing. Okay, so that's completely there. But if you're interested in the question of terror, and you have to go back to Kierkegaard, right? And there are many people who have spoken about fear and how it's deployed. Probably you can go to Master Eckhart would be there. I'm sure that St. Augustine would also talk about fear. And the real other in that sense, the real other in knowledge, I keep emphasizing, all knowledge systems come from religion, right? And the real other in every Semitic religion. In Hinduism, we don't have it because the God as an other, right? We think of it as internal, and that's particularly there in Advaita, right? So if you look at, for Hindus, for example, the point is not really to become a God, it's to transcend God. So at moksha, you go above what any other God is. But in the Semitic, God is constructed as this absolute other, this dangerous God, of William Blake, the tiger, right? a revengeful god, somebody who sends fire and hailstorm, right, to destroy cities which engage in improper activities, right? So different sort of a god over there. And this is the original other. This is the original monster in that sense, that being you cannot understand, that being that you have to be afraid of, what dread hand, what dread feet, right? So of Blake. So we don't know who this person is, and what Kierkegaard does, of course, in his essays, he takes up the story of Abraham, who gets a voice in his head saying, go and sacrifice your son, and being a believer, he sort of tells his son, okay, pick up some sticks, we're going to go up the hill. Doesn't tell his son anything, doesn't tell anyone anything. And he's now deconstructing what Abraham would have gone through at that moment, right? Where this strange God is demanding the sacrifice of your son, right? And this is, Gothic horror happening right now out of the book of Genesis, right? And Abraham is a very important prophet for all the three Semitic religions, Judaism, Christianity, as well as Islam. So and you must read this exegesis. You'll get some ideas regarding how that fear is deployed. But the other person, of course, would be Levinas. And Levinas is, of course, written back to Kierkegaard. But Levinas also talks about the being and the other, and being in time, and how the othering happens. And that is also written out of religious exegesis. Wonderful text. And Levinas is, of course, very critical of Abraham. Levinas thinks that Abraham is this madman, who must be, sort of controlled. कौन ऐसा पागल आदमी अपने बेटे को लेके जा रहा है? I'm sorry for slipping into Hindi. Who's this madman carrying his son up for, sort of sacrifice? And the person who defends Abraham at the end of this long story is, of course, Derrida, right? So you must read Derrida and what he has to say about this as well. So, and Derrida about that fealty or loyalty to that moment. So just to give you an idea of a short reading, for the want of a better thing, to philosophically inquire into the nature of fear, right? And Lovecraft in his letters talks about how he constructs these monsters and these others. And that is really important because in the visual, see, in books, you don't really have graphic representations. In fact, in most of Lovecraft's stories, there is no description of the monster. Either the monster is invisible, or the monster, momentarily appears. There's this sort of a aletheia, this sudden wailing, which is going to happen where this monster will, sort of just manifest, but that is not how movies work, right? So it's Lovecraft and his letters where you get the idea of how these, monsters are being constructed. So you can have a look at that as well. And so thank you for your question. Yes, I hope that I have been able to get through to that. I believe we have one, Vineet Kumar. Wonderful, thank you. Vineet, could you go ahead, please? Yes.
Please unmute yourself, Vineet. We are not able to hear.
I can hear him, yes. Yes, you're audible. Please go ahead. I can hear you. I was not really trying to do that, but I mean, you'll find a lot of stories with homeopathy in it. But that's not the point. What I'm saying is that science fiction does exactly what homeopathy does. It pretends to be scientific, but it is not scientific. It is ideological. That's the point that I'm trying to make. All right, but it would be an interesting exercise, and maybe it can be inquired into as to how homeopathy is presented in fiction and so on. Right. Umesh?
Yes, sir. My question to you. Initially, you mentioned that science fiction writings can also be understood as political tools. To establish this, can you please quote a text or two?
That's precisely what I'm doing. I mean, all the texts I have quoted are precisely political, So H.G. Wells' Time Machine, for example, just to give you or even War of the World. And these are all political texts. They're doing other things. They're not really talking about science at all, right? In fact, all the texts, I mean, even the texts which I have sent out to you, they're all doing exactly the same thing. Srushti, And we'll stop at that. Do we have some more time? We have a little bit more time before we move on. Okay, so Srushti, could you please go ahead with your question? All right, so if Srushti is not there, we'll move on seamlessly into the second part of the thing. And here I would like to read a
Excuse me.
little bit. Okay, and I would like to read a little bit. Yes. Yes.
Shrushti has written her remark. In the material you sent, sir, there are various references of predictions by science coming to reality. Mars and the two satellites in Gulliver's Travel. The science in science fiction is not
Yes.
just the validation, but has a bit of reality to it.
No, I don't deny that there would be see, you throw some speculative fiction out, some of it will, sort of match up. That's exactly how predictive frameworks work, right? So if you look at Nostradamus' predictions, they work on the same way. To speculate, for example, and there's a wonderful speculation which is there in the Quran, that there will come a day that Constantinople will fall, right? And this was taken up by the various caliphs, and later on by the Turks, who sort of succeed them. And Mehmed II was keenly aware of this prediction, right? So him invading Constantinople and throwing all his energies behind it is also a way of validating himself as that holy commander who's blessed in the Quran, right? So there are predictive frameworks which are created, and and of course predictions do come true, right? But that doesn't make it science. That's my point. So I'm sure many of you, I mean, we are in North India. I can see quite a few surnames which would indicate that you would be in conversation with astrologers. And I'm sure some of the astrological predictions they're given have come true, right? But that doesn't make it science, right? So on that same note, and if you understand what I'm trying to get at, that does not necessarily make it science. But good observation. And not only that, I mean, for example, the idea of the rocket, I mean, just to add to what you're saying, I'll give you one more example. So there's this person called Goddard. He reads the War of the Worlds, right? And after that, he goes off to sleep and he thinks of it, right? And he comes up with the idea of a cylindrical rocket that will go out into space. And he's the inventor of the rocket. Does science fiction influence technological advances? Yes, it does inspire technological advances, right? A lot of people, for example, after Star Trek became a very, very, important thing. Many people worked on it, and how can you take an object from place A and move to place B? People have thought over it all over the place. And when scientists are thinking about how space-time fabrics sort of coalesce and come together, the idea of wormholes said that he was influenced by Star Trek. So there are similar analogs. There will always be analogs. There'll be something. So I've given you another reference from the technological sphere and one from theoretical physics, which would find some sort of a reference in literature, right? But that doesn't make it science. That doesn't make it science, right? And I would not like to quote Plato, but just because you can write a poem on surgery, it doesn't make you a surgeon, right? But leaving that aside, I would like to go back very quickly to reading a particular text. And I have now realized that it was over ambitious on my part to sort of send so many short stories out, but they're all similar, they're all similar. So I'm sure that if you read how many of you have read it? Can I get some idea? Maybe then I can skip the reading. How many of you have read the text? All right, so I can see Shushti and I can see very few, in fact, seem to have the confidence of saying that they have read the text, whether they have or not. Please do raise your text because raise your hands, because then I can not have to read, and maybe we can move into the exegesis directly. No, I don't think this is particularly encouraging. We'll have to read it. Now, I'm going to read from a story called Biological. It's there in your handout, and the story. And I'll quickly give out the story. The story is about two research teams in an institution, right? And the two research teams are sort of competing against each other for grants. All right. And one of the teams is led by a woman, all right, and the other team is led by a man. And as things will happen, it's the lady with the research project who gets the grant. And as for the rule of this particular laboratory, all the people now get together. They sort of leave their quarrels aside, and they same project, right? Now, the project which is rejected is regarding how you can use certain certain flavors and smells in order to manipulate the sort of the physiological being of other people, right? And this obviously comes from the idea of pheromones, which would be very new in 1970s in India, that there are certain scents which are triggers for certain things, right? The other one is regarding the commercial manufacture of vanillin, which is basically vanilla flavor, for the want of a better word, and making it in a more efficient and cheaper manner, right? So naturally, the commercially viable option is selected. Okay? The commercially viable option is, of course, the selling of vanilla, right? And lab work goes on. But what happens is that this man realizes that what he does is he creates some pheromones and some chemicals which will sexually arouse the lady who's leading the other team, right? And he puts it in her ice cream, right? And I'll read out this bit, and this will sort of, I think, immediately, hopefully engender a lot of questions. Okay, a lot of questions will come out from this, right? So I'm reading. Towards late evening, Apurva. So Apurva is the name of the man who's leading one of the teams, and Lavanya is the name of the lady who's leading the other team. So towards late evening, Apurva with 2 ice cream confidently entered Lavanya's chamber. So Apurva has already tested this pheromone on his wife, of all people, and that is also a very interesting thing. The wife has this receptacle for all the nonsense that the man has to do, right? Is wonderful sort of a corollary, right? And so it's already been tested on his wife, and now he's come to sort of get his revenge, and in that sense, on Lavanya, right? So he was firmly determined. You always say no to me, Dr. Patgiri, but today you will have to say yes to this ice cream, he said, entering the room. So already we have a very interesting conversation. A dialectic has been set up that you always refuse me, so there's always a negation. But now you must affirm, and there's a sort of a force. It's not simply a question of confidence. There's a linguistic force which is being put in, that now you must say yes to the ice cream, and we know that the ice cream is already dosed, for the want of a better word, right? So it's already a drugged thing, all right? So Lavanya, engrossed in her paper published in the research journal and sitting back with her back to the door, was slightly taken aback. She initially refused again. No, thank you, I'm not feeling like ... That's ellipsis. So before she can sort of complete, she's already going to be interrupted in. But today, Apurva was not going to take no for an answer. He literally thrust one ice cream into her hand and had a spoonful himself from the other, slipped in a bookmark to mark the place she was reading in the journal, and took the ice cream. They started conversing about the weather and the like. I hope you guys have found this. This is on page 236 of the picture. Let me just see if I can locate the page for this. I'm extremely sorry I could not get this OCR read, and that I'm sure has for all of you who have tried reading the text. But let me just find the page number. If somebody has the page number, if you can share that so I can share it with the rest of the people. Yes, it's on page number 24 of the handout of the PDF, right? This story starts on page number 24 of the PDF, and I'm reading something right from towards the end, which is page number 29 of the PDF, or page number 236 of this book, which is published by the National Book Trust. So page number 236 of the book, which is page 29 of the PDF. For all of you who are sort of reading it now and can't find it, please, you may take out this little bit of text, right? I think you found it now. It's page 29 of the PDF, right? Now, after conversing, yes. So Apurva finished his ice cream standing beside Lavanya. And this positionality is interesting. So he's obviously moved next to her. I was happy to know the progress of your project on Spirenthesis pseudomonas at the meeting today. I wish you luck, Dr. Mishra. Lavanya appeared to have perked up a bit. She said in a very soft voice, Dr. Mishra, you have your own project, and I have burdened you with this bio-vanillin project in addition. So from a no to what seems to be a sort of a gradual opening space for further conversation. I think I'm giving you a lot of trouble and not, which is extremely uncharacteristic because it's there's no need for her to say that. My harshness must have made it worse. Tell me, please. She gave him quite an amorous look, and you can underline that. I mean, whatever an amorous look is, and these are very interesting descriptors. I mean, what is going to be construed as an amorous look is, I mean, we have female gaze and male gaze, but amorous gaze, I don't think we have come across. So Apurva took a seat, pulled the chair over a little bit. Doctor, how can we talk about from such a distance? Apurva obliged like an obedient student. And this is another very interesting male fantasy, which is about treating women as also sexualizing that relationship. And I'll come to something right after that, which we can take. She did something which was beyond Apurva's wildest imagination. She delicately placed her right palm on his left cheek and neck and said in a husky voice, "Are you still offended with me, doctor?" This is obviously a direct sexual sort of a message which is being sent out. With a look of disbelief, Apurva looked at Lavanya. And so his experiment has obviously sort of worked. And I mean, he has managed to convince her that he is an object of desire, which is to be sort of possessed and which is something to be taken over. Although he's not, he's just lost the project. So this is his male ego being stoked up and sent back into space, right? That, oh, I have managed to nonetheless win over this woman, right? So I've lost my power, but so what? I still have my masculinity about me. And this, I think, is sort of symptomatic of many, many problems that we have regarding science and the teaching of science, but also attitudes regarding science and women in science. So multiple problems. And I read out this bit because I thought this would very quickly, I mean, for most of us who have obviously not read the text, bring out of text that we are looking at, and they're all very, very interesting texts. You must read them, right? There's no replacement for reading. It's not enough to simply sort of look at a slide or something, right? But I would like to now sort of step out of fiction for a moment, and I would like to talk about this very interesting chap. His name is Tim Hunt. In fact, it's Sir Tim Hunt. So he's been knighted by the Queen, which I have not, as I like to point out every now and then. So he's been knighted by the Queen, and is you can read up on him. You can find him. I don't want to share him or push it at all, but this is a Nobel Prize winning scientist. Okay, and he won his Nobel in the field of medicine and chemistry, right? And so he's a researcher. Okay, he's a researcher, and back in 2015, right, there was this big conference in South Korea, the World Conference of Science Journalists, and he said some really interesting, some mind-blowing things, which are absolutely crazy. So I'm just going to read out what he says. All right, so he says, let me tell you 3 things about my trouble with girls. All right. So, and please note this replacement of woman with girl. So man versus a girl. All right. So there's already there's an added power equation of age, which is added to the supposed power equation of academic superiority, right? So 3 things happen when they are in the lab. I'm quoting exactly what he said, right? 3 things happen when they are in the lab. You fall in love with them. They fall in love with you. And when you criticize them, they cry. And I can share this. Maybe I can share this with you guys on the link. Just give me a moment there. Navigating the chat box. So you can open this link as well, and you can just scroll down to the tweet. All right, the tweet which was taken on St. Louis, and she herself is one of the people who directs the journalism program at City University London, right? And she was attending the conference, so she was getting this from here. So let me tell you 3 things. Let me tell you about my trouble with girls. 3 things happen when they are in the lab. You fall in love with them, they fall in love with you, and when you criticize them, they cry. All right. And after that, he sort of carries on saying, I'm in favor of single-sex labs. He doesn't want to stand in the way of women, right? But this is really mind-blowing stuff, considering this is 2015. So 1970s India, Assam, there's a certain writing which is happening, and by now, we get this idea, that in India we have some problems, and bodies can be burnt in the middle of the night, by anyone. So we have some problems in in the way we approach gender. But to have somebody from England who's a member also of the Royal Society saying something like this gives you a completely different, idea regarding the universality of this problem. Right? This is not something which is really located in India, and I wanted to bring this up because we often just say that in India things are bad. No, it's not about India. It's bad all over the place, and we need to talk about it, and we need to talk about literature which pushes these sorts of attitudes. So imagine the entire generation of people who read Dinesh Chandra Goswami growing up. Their attitude towards women in science have already been framed and made and rehashed. So when they actually meet women in science, they're going to approach them from that same lens which they have been sort of prepped, which they have been groomed into as they were young boys, reading these sorts of fiction. So it's an incredible sort of a presentation which we find in literature, and I'm only looking at this one, but I'm sure there are many other regional or science fiction which would fall into a similar sort of a trope, right? And let's remember Sir Tim Hunt and what he has to say, right? So he's saying very clearly that the only space for women in labs seems to be as sexual distractions for men, and in fact, if there's a problem with that, they should just go to single sex labs, right? Of course, this completely ruins many other things. And for example, we don't even think of single sex anymore. We don't think of single genders anymore, right? So we understand that genders are fluid. We understand that sexuality itself is fluid. We understand that anatomical sex as well is fluid in our day and age. And there's something, I think the wonderful thing has happened in India is that constitutionally you're required to recognize other as a category at the very least, right? So of course we have not really broken up the rainbow, but at least we recognize that there's a rainbow, and I think that's a wonderful thing that the Supreme Court has done, right? But this brings us to something very different and a very different which is the question of how we construct the idea of what is science, or what does it mean to. And I will start off from a sort of a personal anecdote, but I'm sure all of you will be able to relate to this, right? So I had the unfortunate privilege of doing well in my class 10, right? And I was very sure that I wanted to study history, all right? I did not really want to study English as well. And I wanted to study history, and I loved reading history. And I had my revenge eventually because I did my PhD on something which was more about history than about literature. But for the time initially, I was, my parents, there was a fit. I think, my family went into mourning. There were Muharram processions from my neighbor's house to my house every second day. It was a terrible time, right? And I used to simply run off to college. So taking up arts or taking up, liberal humanities, I mean, English is actually better, as I'm saying. So you should take up history. Probably, it's like that's the end of life, right? As you know it. But that all loaded question, and I'm sure all of you have faced this, right? Whether you're boys or girls or whatever identity you would like to take up. But at the same time, within the education system, there is a deep preference of pushing boys into science, and it seems to be all right if your daughter is doing humanities. Okay. And not only this would start from a grooming at a very early age. So the chances of, and this is something which we face or which I have observed, and I'm sure that many of the other teachers and faculties here would also be able to observe this, that often if there is a family with multiple children of multiple genders, it is the boy child who will be given a laptop at an earlier age. It will be the boy child who will be given science education or science tuition, because we all know how atrocious schools are. They're terrible. I mean, even if you go to the best school nowadays, you have to go to coaching to pass any sort of entrance test, right? So it's the boy who will be sent for coaching in sciences, right? The girl will be sent nowhere, ideally, because you save on the money, and you'll constantly tell her that she's not good in studies anyway, so she does not have too much ambition to do anything more than that, right? I'm not saying everyone, but I'm saying that what something that has happened around you, if not to you. And this is a problem. So there is already a differing attitude towards education in science, right? So the social imaginary of learning science is already gendered. It is already gendered. Before we even begin talking about what is science, we have to first ask, who is science for, right? And the answer seems to be science is for men, right? Science is largely for men. And this is not really very fair, because if you look at even English departments across universities, you'll find there are men sitting over there, I mean, including myself, right? Instead of mostly women. So mostly men sitting in the arts departments and all men sitting in the science departments. And it seems to be that there's no space for anyone else. And we, of course, will have silly jokes about gender equality having been achieved, 5,000 years back in the age of Gargi or something, right? So let's try and understand these discourses. They have a narrative, they have a certain this is already in the realm of ideology, as I'm saying, right? So there is a differing attitude in education and science when it comes to men and women in India, and we need to be aware of this, right? And this attitude, unfortunately, is further strengthened. It is further buttressed precisely by these sorts of short stories, precisely by these sorts of fictional engagements, all right, which present women as objects of sexual control. So now two problems happen. The first is that as men, all right, in a masculinity, not masculine, as men, you are encouraged to not send your women out for studies in science. Also because lab work to 2 baje hoga, right? You don't know when lab works will happen, especially, like life science. You have these, like 30 hours you have to go and take. How much has the cell grown or some silly thing like that, right? So it's happening on its own timer, right? And so you have to be out at odd hours. So you don't want to let women, right? And I'm sure all of you have heard that, that wonderful saying that, a woman going out, I'm translated, but a woman going out is like keeping the safe open, tijori khulne jaisa hai. I'm sure you've heard that saying and you understand what I'm talking about. My Hindi is not that great, I'm sorry. So this further makes it difficult for women to get into science, because to think of laboratories in a certain way, science, enfranchisement as some sort of a problem when it comes to, let's say, the virtue and chastity of a woman. And of course, it's always the virtue and chastity of the woman. It's never the virtue and chastity of the man, which is another sort of thing. But I think by now we understand where this is all going, right? Now, I would like to take up another text, and this is a even more, what would I say, sort of a direct sort of a reading, right? So, and this one is called, wait, just give me 1 second. And there are 2 stories in the collection which I have sent. I'm just trying to find the story. It's called Bedroom Energy. So I'm just trying to find the story in the handout. Just give me 1 second. This is the problem precisely with non-OCR text. Yes. So this story begins on page number 12 of the handout, all right, 12 of the PDF. And it sort of finishes, the bit which I want to read is... I'm going to start off by reading this down. Wait, just give me 1 second. On page 92 of the text, which is also page 14 of the handout. All right. So Mrs. Datta groped for something in her large, soft handbag. Then she withdrew her hand from its depths, zipped up the bag, and placed it on my bed. Sigh. Her bosom heaved, and I felt a pang in my heart. Within 3 months of my joining as a scientist at CIENR Bioenergy Group, I received a proposal of marriage from Tapan Datta, Scientist Astro Energy Group. We got scientists. I had not yet decided on my research areas. So in those lonely nights, I would often remember Tapan recollect those wild moments of wild indulgences on our honeymoon. Krishna paused for a while, asked if she could drink the water in the glass. After replacing the glass on the table and without any prologue whatsoever, she placed her hand on my thigh. I must sort of, I forgot to give the background. So this is happening where all these experts are going to decide which project will get funding. All right. So these experts have sort of come together and they're now going to decide which person is going to get funding. And one of these persons is Krishna Datta. She has some sort of a project in her mind and she needs funding for it. So was she imploring me for or offering a plain bribe? Whatever it was, a thrill ran through my entire body. Had there been another glass of water available, I would have drunk it at one go. Krishna lightly massaged my thigh from the knee upwards. My ears must have taken on a reddish hue. I looked straight into her ears. What was she up to? She held my gaze. And you can sort of read on. So what they do is she has created this mechanism, all right, for collecting energy out of people having intercourse. That is basically the story, right? So I'm moving on to page 93. Krishna freed herself. She unzipped her purse and brought out a small and sophisticated device that looked like a combination of radio, TV, car battery, calling bell, and a radar. A bulb much like the one in a torch was glowing in it. I was scared now, God. What was happening? By now, it must be clear to you, doctor. You hold a doctorate in physics. You've been a brilliant student throughout your career. So this ego massaging is going on as well. Was it genuine appreciation or was it sarcasm? Anyways, Krishna went on. For a developing country like ours, every source of energy, be it big or small, is of immense value. After coal and oil, we have wind energy. So this energy crisis as the backdrop of generating some new way of creating energy. Yet the demand is simply escalating and the supply is still quite inadequate. So I have found that the youthful excitement has great potential for energy generation. And you can sort of understand that she proceeds by giving a direct demonstration, which is engage in a sexual act with this person, who immediately, sort of gives consent and sort of pushes that it should be allowed. So everyone wants to dismiss that idea when that is projected. The chairman wanted to dismiss this idea too. I did not give up on it. I argued that it is a bright new idea. Who knows, it may pave the way to solving our energy crisis. Besides, it needed just a few lakh rupees per annum for a period of 4 years. I delivered a spontaneous speech. This is on page 95 of the text, which is also page 15. This is right at the end. And the project was selected. Not only that, I was assigned to supervise its progress on a basis. The fantasy that she'll be forever, be able to access this woman, right? I raised a feeble protest. You must raise a little bit of protest, pretending that I do not know much about bioenergy. And bioenergy by now has a completely different meaning, and we understand bioenergy very differently, right? But the chairman insisted that I take up the project. I have begun to like our chairman. What a genial and fatherly personality he has, right? And so on and so forth. So the other reason why women are sort of placed are that are sort of controlled is that men are in charge of the funding, and this is a really interesting thing. And I'm sure that even now for most of us, it's men who are in charge of the money. Okay, so so you're Ghar Ki Lakshmi and you're also Kam Ki Lakshmi, right? So it's the man who has to come and eventually sanction the funds. And the same story, more or less the same structure is there in the research, which is another story which I have given out for you all. I think the research is on page, here we found it. It's on page number 8 of the handout. And as I now realize, I've actually given this workshop in exactly the opposite direction from which I had initially planned on giving it, but I think they're just flowing from the questions which came up. And in this, it's about, the story is similar, but this is about, control over sexual reproduction. And I put it, the story gives us an opening to sort of look into how women's liberation has been linked with contraceptives. Okay, and there's a lot of work on this area. A lot of preeminent people have written on it. But this is a text which obviously, the author has not read any of that criticism. So it's about this woman who discovers a way of injecting bacteria and sort of controlling reproduction. So whenever you want to actually conceive, and that is when you can sort of conceive, and all other times, you don't need to worry about getting pregnant, right? And this is also structured the same way. There's an expert who has come to this place and finds that the hotel room, there's a connecting door, and this woman is conveniently, has placed herself in the next room, and she sort of explains that she has this wonderful research for checking whether, for inducing infertility, right? And she talks about the importance of population control and all of that. And the same thing happens. She offers herself sexually, and I'm reading the right at the end, the way he's written, and it's a very it's a very it's pretty explanatory. So the next 2 days of the seminar, this is page 78 of the text and page 11 of the handout. The next 2 days of the seminar passed in a jiffy. Sengupta probably noticed something. Sengupta is the superior. So hey, you look so lost. What is the reason? I simply smiled. 16 days after returning from Chandigarh, I got the eagerly awaited telegram from Suman. So they had sex at the peak of her cycle. So, so they're checking out. So, quote unquote, he's checking out, testing out how good the research is. The bacteria work this time, thanks. I sent an official telegram in reply. Rupees 5 lakh sanctioned for this year. So this declarative authority, that utterance in itself, produces money. Almost like God saying, "Let there be light," right? So so please intimate if any other help is needed. Back at office the next day, I made another calculation. Every scientific experiment requires to be put through a repeat test. So the chap has not had enough. He's like, so it's almost like a blackmail setup, right? It's almost like a blackmail setup that you must consent to ABCD, otherwise I will stop the funding. Suman's experiment too needs to be tested more to confirm whether the bacterial strain is really serving the desired purpose. On the 11th day of the coming month, it will be the 28th day of our first meeting. And I'm sure by now the women have got what sort of a conniving gentleman this is. Not very gentle, I guess. Calculation over, I shot another telegram to Suman. Lucknow 11th, kindly arrange accommodation for 3 days. Propose to study your experiment intimately, right? So, just to give, I mean, it's obviously we are now definitely running out of time to some extent, and also because I would ask all of you to respond, and I'm going to do that right away. So there is a set of long questions, the 3 long questions. You're free to write as much as you want, but please do write at least 150 to 250 words. You don't, there is no right or wrong answer. Okay, let's get this idea of correct answers out of the way. It's more about trying to see how you're looking on these texts, post the workshop than anything else. So don't get overtly worked up about whether the answer is right or wrong, and you don't need to worry about that. So I'm sending in the link again. I think you guys can just open it and check whether you can get this link. This is the link for the long questions. All right, and just like last time, we'll sort of pause a bit over here, and I'm opening the floor for questions, and we'll take maybe another 5 or 10 minutes. I know we had promised a break in the middle, but if everyone is fine, we'll just carry on. Otherwise, if you want, you can take a short break now as well before you sit down to sort of look at the answers. And please let me know if you have any issues. And also opening the floor out to questions. Right. Thank you. All right, so I can see in the chat box here that there are some problems with the links. I'm sure that you'll be sent the links again. You're being sent the links again. And in the meantime, again, if there are any questions, you may open up for questions.
With such a detailed talk and point-to-point structured arguments that you have built up your talk with, Dr. Siddhartha, I'm sure all of us are so benefited. And maybe the participants are busy filling up the forms.
I hope the second form link is there. Ma'am, did you get the second form link? Could you share it with the participants?
Okay, sir, I will.
I'm sharing it again in case this one is not working. The second one. This is so this should be the long questions. Please let me know if this is working now. Right. Okay, and if there are no questions, I'm sure there are some questions. You don't need to fill this up now. All right. Let me sort of just make sure that the link is opening. You can see the long questions. You can see the boxes, and stop over there. And you can fill this up later. You don't need to fill this up now. All right. Please don't fill this up now. If there are any questions, I want to finish with the questions, and I would like to sort of uh, give or propose a short structure through which I have been reading these texts. All right. And you can we can sort of take you can write it out after that. Okay, so you can write out your answers after that, and we can maybe leave the link open for maybe 3 or 4 hours, and you can take maybe the evening to think over the things and do other things. So let's first do the question answers. You're free. You can fill up the answers till evening. You don't need to do it now. Think over what you want to write on, right? And so, if there are any questions, we'll take that up. Okay, then we'll seamlessly sort of move into the rest of my thing. I want to bring up one more point, right? So, and this is particular. All right, Ragini has a question, it seems. Please go ahead.
Yes, sir. Like you talked about the involvement of women in science, especially science fiction or the adaptations which we see. Like one deviation which I've seen, that the modern adaptations of classics seem to involve women more. Like if we see, be it like the latest one, if I remember, is the Sherlock Holmes adaptation, the BBC one, which is a modern adaptation of the work. There's this
Mhm.
character of Molly Hooper, which is obviously not in the originals, but we have her there. So I think
Mhm.
some things are changing slowly, but there is involvement of women now. Earlier, they were being marginalized or given character roles, but I think the projection of women in the original part of the Sherlock Holmes series was also, I think, Arthur Conan Doyle has projected women in a way good. If we see the character of Harry Ned, not taking science fiction in general, it's way ahead of its time. And I think the modern adaptations are involving women in science in particular. We see women in labs working with men and actually even smarter than them. The projection is there.
Yes.
So I think few things are changing, but there's still that stereotype is there, very much there, because we see them not as the main character, but as supporting characters. I think so. Something in that session, I think that I would like to add on.
Right. Thank you for your comments, Ragini. So, if I can sort of just to respond to that, you're right. But this has been a process of continuous struggle. So, I mean, and this is like over 40, 50 years of gender struggle in this country. And one of the landmark things that happened is the Vishakha judgment, right? And you must look at the Vishakha judgment. And following the Vishakha judgment, the first GS cache was set up in Jawaharlal Nehru University by a person called Dr. Now she's a PhD, by Albina Shakil. Right now she's a lecturer in OP General Law. Right, she's a lecturer in OP General Law. She's a professor. I'm so sorry. She's a professor in OP General Law now. And Albina D had actually set up that first GS cache. So the institutional responsibility in ensuring that there is space for women, one, there is representation of women, two, and there is no harassment of women, right? Three. So this was something that Chaka guidelines. And then following that, and I think that another moment which has to be sort of marked out is the Justice Verma Committee report, right? And the Justice Verma Committee report also involves a lot of people that who have done sterling work, including people like Ruchira Sen, VI Levin, right? They are now faculty. At that time, they were young students, but they're thanked by name in the Justice Verma Committee report. You can open the report, the very first page, you'll find the names. You'll find Kavita Krishnan's name there, right? So there has been a lot of organized work in ensuring that there's a sort of a pushback, and the representations, of course, which you get now, particularly from the West, are very good. All right, the ones which are coming from the West are very good, but nonetheless, and you spoke about Molly Hooper. Molly Hooper is completely an addendum. I mean, to Sherlock Holmes. Even in the BBC series, right? Whereas there's far more space given to the sort of homoerotic sort of space that Moriarty constructs around him. That is far more permissive. But the way Molly is constantly just rejected, and of course Sherlock is asexual, so it's almost like Jughead and Big Ethel, right? I mean, and that sort of relationship. So I don't know if it is really recognizing Molly. I mean, some episodes, yes, there is a recognition. There is a sort of a reach which Sherlock makes. He does it in one episode, I remember, where he tries to make up for being. But it's almost like Sherlock can behave the way he wants to because he's Sherlock, right? This arrogance of certainty, and that you will find in another character who's also a detective, but a medical detective, and that's Dr. House. And I don't know if you've seen Dr. House, but House also behaves very weirdly with women around him, right? He's not particularly a sexual character, but the way he behaves is extremely, condescending and put down, and that sort of thing. So this is a trope. This is a literary trope which exists, and I think, of course, the new representations coming out, the new things happening, and of course, I'm saying that is there. But what I'm saying is this is a very important. This is a very important thing which we have to look at when we look at science, and when we get. That's the point that I wanted to make. So there must be institutional responsibility. That's one part, one thing that I want to talk about. And many Indian women and feminists, and I've named quite a few, have been a part of this process, and they've contributed in a sterling manner to it. And this has led to policy change, right? So it's not simply about going on the street with placards. They have actually changed laws. They've actually created new frameworks. Okay, that's a wonderful thing to have happened. And the second thing is, yes, depictions have changed. There is far more space for women in many narratives. But it's an ongoing battle, and we should take it with that sort of a spirit. So thank you, Rani.
Thank you, sir.
Right. So on that note, if there are no further questions, I would yes. I'm sorry, I think there's a lag. You're trying to say something, Ragini? I think no.
No, sir.
All right. So on that note, if there are no further questions, I would like to sort of just finish off this discussion and regarding the text which I have sent you. So Goswami's stories, despite their science fiction tropes and the hint of a future flavor, he has that thing, some it's yet to come, nonetheless recreate many aspects of the modern Indian setting, especially when it comes to its treatment of gender. And by modern, I mean 70s and 80s, 90s, and not now. So in many ways, his stories reflect not how gender will be treated in the future, but rather how it is treated in his day. On the one hand, his students reduce the woman to being dependent on a male agency for financial support, right? And this, of course, is the grand, sort of narrative. So this allows men to ultimately treat women as objects of sexual gratification who can be paid off through capital. So it's almost like the world's oldest profession reinvented. The other common trope is that of women being treated merely as sites of production that can be technologically controlled, right? So women are represented as producing sexual, creative, and reproductive energy, and the stories ensure that they are controlled by the male, despite the fact they're primary in the act of production. So it's the woman who produces. It's the woman who's creative. And even in science fiction, as I said, right from the beginning, you'll find the women, right? The paper will proceed through a close reading. So I'm reading out this paper of these, stories, in order to sort of place them, right? So in some way. So in the stories, the research, bedroom energy, and the hair timer, I've given you all these three texts and others. The female is presented seemingly as an empowered, educated, and emancipated individual who nonetheless has to approach the male who's the source of funding, right? In the first two stories, that's research and bedroom energy, the granting of funds for research is the direct result of which are demanded in return. In the last, the sexual favor is payment not for a research grant, but rather for a research itself, right? So in all the three stories, women, despite their intelligence, hard work, and all their agency, they're reduced to being objects for the of men. Men too, and this is also very important. And many of my friends are working on masculinity studies because it's not like patriarchy is very good to men. I mean, it forces men to do strange things, right? And very dehumanizing things at the end of the day. So men too are reduced to being pliable only to sexual seduction rather than having any rational sense in their allocation of grants for research. All three have male narrators who are in some power to influence the allocation of research grants. And in all three stories, the women approach the man in a direct manner, recreating moments out of the male fantasy, which the male finds impossible to resist. In order to look at some of the specifics, we shall, look at just one, and I'm going to look at the research only. So the research narrates how a certain Mrs. Manchanda, a scientist of the Drug Research Laboratory, comes for a 3-day seminar to Chandigarh in order to win funding for an anti-pregnancy medication that she has been developing in her laboratory. She manages to find a room adjoining the narrator and prepares to play the part of a seductress to perfection, even down to the pink gown that she's wearing, right? So as she declares, what is the purpose of calling us from our laboratories to listen to theoretical gibberish? This time I have come prepared to challenge. So she's realized that she's not going to get money because of any academic sort of engagement. She'll only get money through seduction. And this brings to mind, Baudrillard's second book. I don't know if you guys have heard of Baudrillard, who talks about simulation and simulacra, very important in digital text. But his second book is called Seduction, and it's about how women and men can use seduction as a feminine, sort of strategy in order to not get into the process of production. Again, this story actually absolutely bang on fits into that, model of seduction, which. So the two rooms are interconnected, and the narrator manages to bungle his way in thinking that the interconnecting door is the way to a bathroom. He comes upon the married woman in her early 30s, reclining on the bed in a flimsy pink nightgown, immersed in a book. So instead of screaming at him to go away or calling for security, the woman invites him in and reveals that she knows him and that she too is a scientist. She immediately attacks the restricted nature of plants and science, maintaining that it is impossible to determine the exact cost benefit of any product in R&D projects. She qualifies this statement by talking about Edison's invention of the bulb. She describes the many struggles of Edison, which ended with, after spending a fortune and doing a lot of research, the bulb he finally invented remained lit for 40 hours, only 40 hours. It's not a very long-lasting thing. So by this statement, she points out that if judged for cost benefit in a manner similar to what they are being expected to do, often, and this happens to all of us, right? So maybe not for money, but we have all faced PhD entrances. I'm sure many of us are research scholars, right? So you go in with this proposal and somebody asks, what is the use of this? And the point is that knowledge cannot be sort of weighed in utility terms, and it has to be independent of immediate use value. And that's the reality of science. And there was no use of zero, but now look at where we have come. So she therefore engages in a game of seduction, gaining proximity, charge of the funds, and enamoring him with sort of a voyeuristic access. So she's ensured that the door is open, he can enter. So he comments, her body swayed attractively as she used her hands to sweep back her long and luxuriant hair. Her absolute dismissal of me did not embarrass me. I think I rather enjoyed her angry yet serious demeanor. She tightened at her waist the lacy belt of her nightgown. My heart skipped a beat. Mrs. Manchanda got down from the bed, put on her slippers. How delicate and feet are, right? Small aside. So she follows it up with asking him out on the pretext that she does not know Chandigarh, and then proceeds to have dinner with him before inviting him back to her room at night. The lights are turned down, and pretty soon he starts addressing her as Suman instead of the formal Mrs. Manchanda. And the translator notes there's a corresponding shift from aap, in Hindi you would say aap as a formal thing, and tum, which would be more informal, in a matter of addressing her. So the entire stage has been set for the inevitable sexual act, but there is the matter of morality. Itself must have a reason beyond the banal quotidian theme of sex for benefits. I mean, that is so boring, right? And this is where the science kicks in. So what is the reason for having this in science fiction? I mean, this could have been any business proposal, right? You have, this could be anything. But no, science was kick in. Mrs. Manchanda has developed a bacterial strain that will revolutionize the sexual act. On being released, the bacteria will travel on its own amongst the population, rendering all women sterile, unless they are on antibiotics like penicillin, right? So that would be a complete inversion of the current means of contraception that uses medication to temporarily fertility. She's not getting the funding to be able to test or refine the bacterial strain. Therefore, she's forced to seduce him in order to finish her research. So who will volunteer for free? And this I'm quoting from the text. There are no volunteers for my research. Hence, I am making a guinea pig of myself. I am currently at the peak of my fertility curve, and the bacterium culture is here on the petri dish on the table. Now, doctor, would you be so good as to volunteer, please? So this is there on page 78. Sexual act therefore becomes a necessary precondition for the testing of the revolutionary research and not a mere sexual escapade. So the story is a little different in that sense. So it's not just for sex. The pretense of scientific rigor is continued through the rest of the story, where Mrs. Manchanda, and this I've already read this out. So where he must go after a certain number of days in order to make sure that the project is being funded. The project being funded is correct. So what is clear from the story? Both the male and the female are being contained in certain modes of patriarchy that exist in our society and are finding voice in the science fiction as well. Sex is seen as a commodity for appeasement of the male. The female seduces and pleasures the male and gets him to sponsor her research. The male is perpetually in need of sexual gratification and falls for the obvious and direct seduction, agreeing to liberally fund the woman as long as he's sexually satisfied. Right? Are used to further allow and encourage this sort of sexual interaction. So in this particular science fiction imaginary, right? The second is, controlling gender by controlling production. And this is there in Biological, Photosensitive, and Like a Wave, among many others. The female is shown to be naturally repressed and dissatisfied due to various reasons. And this is another thing. So if you look at, Goswami's work, many of the women in science are divorced or are people who, and they seem to be somehow constructed as this woman in need, this sad woman with a want, this womb which is not filled up, this choric space in Derridian, the way Derrida would talk about it, this empty choric space which in order to complete the identity of the woman, right? And this is also deeply problematic, extremely problematic sort of a depiction, right? So no matter that the woman is educated, capable, beautiful, and everything else, she's found to be, unaware of her sexuality or having no sexual vent or being asexual, and she has to be sort of triggered or whatever. And we read a little bit about that as well. So either she's portrayed to be sterile or a divorcee or as a woman whose husband has no interest in her. That's another trope, that the husband is not interested. She's too smart for the husband and, or something of that sort, right? She must be technologically tuned into accepting her sexuality by the male researcher who seem to be liberating her from her limited, joyless world. Okay. This is a very strange construct. And I'm sure that this would echo beyond science faculties as well. I'm sure that the women in service would say that this happens to them as well. This is achieved through the use of electromagnetic radiations in one story, sounds and natural herbal formulations, right? So the formulation which is given in the ice cream, right, in order to awaken women's latent sexuality. So what must be noted is that the women are deemed attractive because of their productivity, education, and beauty, which are already manifested in the woman, right? So what makes the women attractive is precisely that. Right? By bringing the women back to the sexual arena, she's been brought back to a mode of control that patriarchy is comfortable with. Patriarchy is comfortable with controlling women in this way. It's not comfortable with women being, productive on their own research. That is not something that men are really interested in, right? So she's being denied her productivity and being turned into an object of desire. And in Biological, this is, sort of brought into focus that the real fact that the woman is actually better than the man is not only in conceptualizing projects, but also winning funding. So the woman is just better. The man's reducing the woman to a sexual object becomes a tactic for bringing her back into control and power, right? So the trope of hunger and the inability of engage in the food economy of that story, Lavanya and Apurva, uh, uh, parallels the desire for sex and the inability of Apurva to engage in it. So Lavanya wins her research grant by also providing the HRGC with vanilla ice cream. The woman is the source of sexuality and food. And even in the HRGC meeting, after 1.5 hours and 150 ice creams, the special review meeting was declared over, and with it, Apurva's hopes of getting a grant. His discovery that his work had brought about a change in the personality of his wife, who had accidentally eaten ice cream tainted with his chemicals, however, helps him decide to refocus his energies back to his old project. The results of his chemicals are startling. His wife, and the wife as the silent other, not only welcomed him to a well done up, but it's not only a sexual thing. She's cleaned up the house for him. And I mean, just think of the way in which this is constructed, the good wife, being constructed, but also prepared a nice dinner, right? So she's also cooked food for him, which is also, I'm sure, one of the requirements, which by now we have started criticizing a little bit, but it's there. And serving him chicken palav. And this would in North India be a transgression, this would be a very personal transgression, that you're having non-vegetarian food together, right? And then in the bed, they relive their first night with prolonged session, characterized by mutual interest, excitement, curiosity, and warmth, right? So this is there on page 234. We've read a bit of this. What is of interest is that the male never requires any stimulant in order to enjoy his sexuality. I mean, the real, the spectral thing is that it is men who require, treatment for infertility. It's usually, it's the man who requires it. It's not really the woman who requires it, right? It is the female who must, but in the stories, it is the female radiated or experimented on in order to free her from the superego that society imposes and liberate her sexually, at least in the works of Goswami, right? So Apurva fine-tunes his research and ultimately produces a chemical equivalent which can be surreptitiously mixed. And this is absolutely dosing. I mean, this is illegal, this is something which would be seen as criminal, right? But is presented almost like, oh, ye to chalta hai, sort of thing, right? So, and we have to sort of understand this, right? Product on his wife with great success. However, we realize that sexual satisfaction is not to be had from the figure of the docile and uninteresting wife. And this is very important. Apurva can only assert his masculinity by sexually possessing Lavanya, who's the asexual other, is the person who has deprived him of his funding, and he can only come out, quote unquote, and this is from the story, shining better than the project leader of the original victorious team by reducing Lavanya into a site of production of sexual release for himself. This short story ends with Apurva realizing Lavanya seemed to be a transformed person. So she must be contained and transformed back into that imaginary. And the short story ends alluding that he finally manages to fulfill his desires with her. The female who's productive seems to escape the control of the male order and take on a life independent of them. And this is the central by depicting women to be essentially unhappy in a world devoid of male sexual attraction. By bringing the woman back into the realm of sexual pleasure, production for the male to savor and satisfy himself, therefore, is not an attempt to liberate women sexually, but rather to control them and possess them by the male order. Right. So through this short survey, what I'm arguing is that the liberation and frank sexuality, and this is how he's presented by his translator. This is the citation which is given in the introduction, that he's just a person who's talking about sexual liberation. It's almost like Vietnam war is over and we are all doing hippie children, and it's fine to write in this way, right? So that is how the translator presents his work, and I have attached that forward as well in the notes. You can have a look at it, which is extremely problematic, right? The Goswami's fiction instead hides under its surface deep anxieties as to the role of women in a society where they have access to education, and through it controls of production. The males in his fiction resort to one of two strategies in order to establish a continued dominance over this woman. Firstly, the male is shown to be controlling the source of capital or funding necessary for the woman to be able to successfully produce knowledge. Secondly, the male, having failed to control the woman through capital, let's say he's not getting the money, he's not in charge of the funding, right? Then the control is by trying to control the woman by imposing a moral order which sees sex as natural and necessary, thus owning the woman and controlling her as a site of production of the personal sexual gratification of the male character. So, however, within the structures that Goswami creates, which are all real and relevant to our own society, I mean, there is a link. It's not that it's gone. There lies imaginaries that destabilize these attempts of continued patriarchal hegemony. So in the first story, by turning women in general into sterile creatures incapable of producing children without medication, Mrs. Manchanda establishes the possibility of sex for women without production. And this is another thing. Often within the story, some strategies for, escaping the ties of patriarchy, right? So she turns herself into its first example. The woman who can have sex whenever she wants, with whomever she wants, without any risk of pregnancy. Mind that this story is in a world before the AIDS pandemic. So nowadays, of course, you wouldn't think of it the same way, right? Because ever since HIV, and HIV is also linked with the movement for the queer movement, right? So because the immediate attack of AIDS happened on the queer community, particularly men, and particularly in Philadelphia. And there's a wonderful movie called Philadelphia. If you guys haven't seen it, you can see it. But the world of this particular short story is before the AIDS pandemic, right? So this strategy has profound implications. And in fact, control over reproductive processes is something that many feminists have talked about, right? So Helen Sisu has talked about it. I think, I think many others, I mean, like Sisu for sure has talked about it, but I think Greer, others, they have also spoken about the importance of being able to control reproduction, and that's having some say in that process. The woman can effectively engage with patriarchal attempts to reduce her to a site of only sexual production by turning into a site of pure seduction and resisting male-ordered sexual reproduction as the norm of her being. So women are constantly reduced as sites of reproduction, of the progeny. That is the norm of a being. What is the norm of being a mother? It's motherhood, and that, of course, has been brilliantly challenged in this recent Gyan course on motherhood, which happened out of AMU. If you guys can see the videos, you can see it later. But instead of doing that, by refusing to reproduce, and instead by going back to being a site of pure seduction, that is already resisting the male order and in some way. And Baudrillard notes this. So she says, seduction is always more singular and sublime than sex, and it commands the higher price, right? So she can instead engage in scientific production and through it, the market and the world. In the second story as well, we find an affirmation of this idea, wherefore, as long as Lavanya refuses to engage in sexual production, she continues to be the productive creator with her own independent projects, journals, and writings, and so on, right? So patriarchy, it seems, uses the same tactics to dominate women as capitalism does. And this, of course, would have its discontents, but to dominate the proletariat. So just as the capitalist order, the worker is constantly reduced to begging for funds to exist in the competitive cutthroat world that capitalism claims is free and fair, the woman also is forced to beg for funds from the male patriarchal order, which claims it is comfortable with women working. And we must remember Tim Hunt and the Nobel Prize winning Tim Hunt and his strange comments, right? So it would be interesting to see how strategies of seduction can evolve to provide a counter to the hegemonies of patriarchy and capitalism. So on that note, I would like to end. If there are any further questions, comments, or queries, we are open for that. I'm also sharing. Somebody had asked for a write-up. So this is a published paper. This has already been published. You can have a look at it. You're free to reference it and cite it all you want, if in case you guys are writing as well. A very simple structure to try to understand these texts. So the floor is open. If there are any queries or questions, I would like to we can take them. Yes. Right. And if there are no further questions, then I think I should hand over the baton to Dr. Jimmy Sharma. And I think we have finished more or less on time, maybe a little over time. Thanks a lot, ma'am, for this opportunity to share my ideas and Also, thanks a lot to all the participants who interacted and spoke back and sort of made the session lively. The link for session has been shared. I hope you guys have been able to open it. The other link
Dr.
as well.
Siddharth,
If you
someone
have
was
not been able to
asking,
open it, please let me know. Yes,
we can
yes, Dr.
send
Sharma.
answers by tonight. So there is
Sorry?
this question in the chat. There is Raj Kumar. He is asking,
Could you
shall I
repeat what you said?
feedback by tonight, ma'am? Maybe the question is about the long
This is
questions
not a feedback.
that you
It's a
gave.
set of long questions. I guess they can send by night, by 9 o'clock or something. That would be fine. They can take some time over it and they can respond by 9 at night, right? But by 9 o'clock, right? So I'm putting this in the chat box as well, so it's there on record. Please respond to the long question by 9 at night. That's today, which is 7/2022. Another thing, so I have about 46 responses on the short questions, right? At the very outer limit, I'm not expecting any responses beyond that. So by 9 o'clock, whatever comes in, we'll take that as the number. If any of you are interested in getting in touch with me, this is my number. And you're free to WhatsApp me or you can call me. And this is my personal email ID, which is not there on the website. So in case you guys want to talk to me about your
Valeria has
research
a
or want to share
question
your
to ask.
ideas,
Okay.
you can send me mail on this ID. So I've put in my phone number and my email ID on the chat. I'm usually available on these, so you may drop me a mail or whatever. Right. So on that note, someone has a question, ma'am?
Yes, Valeria wanted to ask, where are we going to put Brave New World by Aldous Huxley?
Brave. I'm not looking at that text in this particular session, but there are many things in Brave New World as well. I mean, you can do a complete lecture on that. In fact, we had spoken earlier, and I believe that Dr. Sharma wanted a session on gaming and science fiction, which I think can also be a very interesting sort of a thing. It'll take some time for me to design it. But this session was on Indian science fiction, so I'm not going to respond to that in this session. But I'm sure that if there's further space, we can take up other texts. I mean, of course, Brave New World is one of the seminal texts of science fiction imaginaries, right? So, not the place for that discussion right now. Yes. Anyone else?
I, on the behalf of Literary Club, IIHS, and Kurukshetra University, Kurukshetra, extend a heartfelt in my mind at the time of inception. Both the sessions took that particular structure. I will take this opportunity by thanking first Dr. Siddhartha for taking us to the pragmatic application of reading and criticizing Indian science fiction. The way we were taught this, what we call pragmatic criticism, the practical application, all the points that we have been talking about, reading about, you literally made us experience all the points. Dr. Siddhartha, for such an talk, detailed reading, the kind of closed near future also we'll be planning many more events and engaging you as well with our participants. One more thing will need to be mentioned here, because if we don't thank our participants who have shown such involvement in both the sessions, their questions, their participation is really endearing and motivating to all of us. Thanks, Dr. Shayon. Thanks, Dr. Siddharth, for such wonderful sessions. Thank you so much. Thanks, dear participants.
Great. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Dr. Sharma, and also Dr. Shayon. Wonderful listening to you. I think far more organized in some ways than I possibly was. And it's always wonderful to collaborate, and we are in your open for any sort of collaboration. And so we're looking forward to having more such sessions. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Can we put on our videos on so that we can have a screenshot? Can we all put on our videos?
Yes,
thank you.
And also thank you, Dr. Siddharth, for such a wonderful session, because the amazing instances that you drew from the text, they were so fascinating. And thanks for sharing those snippets from the text as well, because it was so relatable to the different aspects that we were talking about, the different dynamics of Indian science fiction. And whatever I could gather from those brief snippets, that it is so important once again for us to really think beyond the mainstream ways of interpreting Indian science fiction, or most importantly identifying Indian science fiction texts, and try to look into those spaces which are still very unexplored. So I think it was a very powerful session, Dr. Siddharth.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
So there were queries regarding certificates in the chat box section also, and others. I've been receiving mails. So certificates, all of you will get certificate once you submit the feedback forms. And we have now decided that a fortnight or within this month, I'll be mailing you your certificates. Have a good time ahead. Good day to all of you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.